Today we are going to talk about Pragmatism by William James. William James was one of the first psychologists, and during his time, he would be known as a philosopher. And he, in particular, was contrasted with William Wundt in Europe. Wundt was more focused on behavior and human reaction, and James was more focused on the internal structure of what someone's thinking about, so he thought thoughts were more important. Of course, they're harder to measure scientifically, so he speculated about a lot of ideas, which later came to become demonstrated more concretely as technology improved, in particular emotion, although that's not what pragmatism is about. Pragmatism is a form of truth theory that's quite divergent from the other ones. So, just very quickly, I'd like to talk about the other ones. So, broadly speaking, there's objectivism, at least in the Western type of philosophy background. There's objectivism, which states that things are knowable in a particular and absolute way. This is a very rough kind of overview. And then there's relativism, which is you can know something, but only relative to particular facts or situations. And then there's nihilism, which is you can't really know anything. And usually these are applied in specifically in the case of morality, where nihilism is like there are no values. Relativism is every value is relative to the culture. So what's moral for one culture might not be moral for the other. And then nihilism's just like you can't even asking if something's moral or not is just not even a truth apt question. You can't determine whether or not that sort of statement is true or false. What William James offers in pragmatism is something that is a lot different in the way of truth theory, which the best way to, I think, understand it is that truth is performative rather than something inherent in the object itself. Truth is a sort of activity you engage in, although the more explicit way he defines it is kind of whatever is useful is what's true, although it sounds like just a convenient way of thinking when you think of it like that, but when you think of it as a performance, his ideas make a little bit more sense. So I'm going to read a passage from his and talk about some of the ideas in the books and then go into the review. Okay. Certain ideas are not only agreeable to think about or agreeable as supporting other ideas that we are fond of, but they are also helpful in life's practical struggles. If there be any life that it is really better, we should lead. And if there isn't any idea which, if believed in, would help us lead that life, then it would be really better for us to believe in that idea, unless, indeed, belief in it incidentally clashed with other greater vital beliefs. And then in quotes. What would be better for us to believe? That sounds very like a definition of truth. It comes very near to saying what we ought to believe, and that definition, none of you would find any oddity. Ought we not to believe what it is better for us to believe? So, one of the crux types of ways, pattern that an object or a pragmatist conception really leans on is usually what would be considered true in an objectivist way of thinking is what's useful to believe is true, right? But when you turn over, there are certain things that a pragmatist would not want to engage in, and something that James repeatedly talks about is what's the cash value of your belief. And so there are some like metaphysical ideas or complex philosophical ideas that are abstract, and the objectivist would say, well, is it A or is it B? And the pragmatist, or what William James would argue you should do, is say, well, what's the practical difference between believing A and believing B? And if there is no practical difference, then it doesn't matter which you believe, or perhaps you shouldn't even be thinking about it. And so that asking yourself the question, what's the practical use of it? That's a procedural difference. Instead of asking what's true, asking the effects of what happens when I believe this. And so, it's perhaps not even. There are other forms of pragmatism other than William James's, but it's perhaps not even. Shouldn't even be included with other truth theories in terms of philosophical discussion, because it's so much different than the other ones. There's a few other points he makes that I find really interesting. Let's pull that out. One of them is that what you are doing a lot of in terms of what... Okay. One of the things is that... Here we go. A lot of times what you believe is true, if you were following an objectivist sort of paradigm, you confirm everything's true yourself, and you sort of verify. Verification's really important. But what James points out is almost all your knowledge that you have, you get from someone else, and you don't verify yourself. Instead, you're taking their word that it's good, and it's this sort of thing where almost everything's learned socially, but very little of it's verified. And why do we do this? Well, because it's more practical. If you verified every single bit of knowledge yourself, then that would just be an impossible sort of task. An example I've heard used before for this type of idea is you don't know that you can't jump out of a 10-story building from first-person experience, right? Because you probably haven't jumped out of a 10-story building. But if you do it, man, that's a really bad idea. So you should just believe you shouldn't jump out of a 10-story building. Now, I'm not telling you this from first-person experience because I've never done it, but, you know, it's a bit of a facetious example, but you get the point. So here's a passage I thought was interesting for that. Truth lives, in fact, for the most part, on a credit system. Our thoughts and beliefs pass so long as nothing challenges them, just banknotes pass so long as no one refutes them. But this all points to a direct face-to-face verification somewhere. Without that, the fabric of truth collapses like the financial system with no cash basis whatsoever. You accept my verification of one thing, I yours of another. We trade upon each other's truth, but beliefs verified concretely by somebody are the posts of the whole superstructure. So someone out there confirms it, but we can't confirm it ourselves, which is an interesting idea. Another one idea that he points out that I thought was particularly interesting was he talks about how one of the things that is an impediment to us assimilating new knowledge is if it is inconsistent with the rest of our knowledge, we will tend to shy away from it. And so part of the new knowledge we can assimilate has to do with consistency with our current worldview, and we will tend to take the path of least resistance. So if a theory is easy to, or consistent with what we think, we will be able to assimilate it much more easily. So let's get into the ratings. So for utility, I gave it a 5. I think that it's fairly abstract, and in that sense, it's not of tremendous utility. But the flip side is there are certain little bits like, is this belief useful? These types of questions you can ask yourself, which I think are tremendously useful when constructing a worldview. So to me, that bumps it up to net neutral. There's not a lot of practical information, but almost by the very nature of the theory itself, which is you're believing in what's useful, it tends to lend itself towards utility, even though it's very theoretic. For entertainment, I gave it a 3. This partially has to do with style and readability. It was written like James, I'm not sure when it was written, but James was active the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And so it's written kind of in Old English. Like there are some words that are spelled differently than how they are today. and it's can be a little bit get bit of a slog. He talks about some topics that I think aren't particularly interesting, like his exploration of monism versus dualism, as well as I think his characterization of pragmatists and empiricists are funny. He refers to, not pragmatists, rationalists and empiricists. He refers to rationalists as being soft-minded and empiricists as being hard-minded, which I thought was entertaining a little bit, but perhaps not entertaining in an objective sense if you don't have a background in philosophy. For interest, I gave it an 8.5. The ideas are a bit divergent in terms of what might be considered, when people talk about truth, they normally have this Western attitude of facts are facts. And so James's sort of criticism of that perhaps not being tenable, and what we really are engaging in, for him, in part, he's saying this is actually how we behave, not how we say we behave. Where he's talking about facts are what's useful instead of facts are facts is a bit interesting. That's kind of the same reason why I gave it a novelty of 7.5. For style, I gave it a 4.5. It's not tremendously well written. I do think some parts of the way he phrases stuff is entertaining, and so it gets a little bit up. My understanding is that this book is a collection of lecture notes, and so that somewhat explains why maybe it's not the most refined prose. Readability, I gave it a 4. It's kind of abstract. It's a bit of a slog. Maybe it should have even scored lower. Which is why difficulty got a 3.5 for an overall score of a 5.14. Although I don't think it deserves that low of an overall score. It's what I've been noticing when rating the more abstract philosophy books is they tend to score lower, which isn't necessarily fair, because I feel like my rating system doesn't take into account as much the type of book it is, where the abstract philosophy types of books are perhaps less directly useful, but they are often good building blocks for ways of thinking about things. And so they sort of lay a foundation for other more useful stuff to be assimilated better. So, what's an example? So, William James's idea of pragmatism is perhaps a little bit clunky and only scores a 5 on utility, but then there's, let's say, a book like the As-If Principle, which talks about how your body tends to lead your mind. And so, for example, there's like a study where people negotiate more fiercely if they have more confident posture. And what you could extrapolate from that is, I should have more confident posture. And so this, if I want to be more confident. But then this ability to fake it until you make it type of thing that the other book suggests might be more palatable with the foundations of pragmatism, let's say. As far as discussion goes, what is one thing that you think is useful to believe but isn't necessarily true in the conventional sense? So I will give an example is there are varying types of confidence or the belief in your social value, which I think is subjective anyways. But if social value was objective, believing you have more social value than you do actually seems like it'd be useful, because being confident is useful. Anyways, if you like this video, feel free to give it a like. And if you want to see more, feel free to subscribe, and have a good one.